In 1903, a man named Henry Ford raced a car across a frozen lake at 91 miles per hour. Not because he had to, not because anyone told him to, but because nobody told him he couldn't. And somewhere in that simple, reckless act of defiance lives the entire spirit of what we're about to talk about. Because 70 years after Ford went racing on ice, a German company from Stuttgart did something similar. They built a machine so outrageously, so violently, so incomprehensibly fast that it didn't just win races. It murdered an entire racing series. Ended it. Finished it. Not with a dramatic crash or a scandal or a sponsor pulling out, but with sheer, overwhelming, suffocating dominance. The kind of dominance that makes other competitors question whether they should even bother showing up. This is Engineera, and I spend way too much time thinking about the golden era of motorsport. If you're someone who loves the raw, unfiltered, rule-free days when engineers could dream without limits and drivers were half madmen, half geniuses, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Now here's what I want you to understand before we get into the meat of this story. The Porsche 917-30 didn't just win a championship. It exposed something deeply uncomfortable about human nature. About competition. About what happens when one team does exactly what the rulebook allows, executes it to absolute perfection, and the response from everyone else isn't admiration. It's panic. It's desperation. It's changing the rules of the game because you simply cannot beat the other player at their own game. That's the real story here. And trust me, by the time we're done, you'll see this not just as a motorsport story, but as something that speaks to every competitive arena in human history. So let's go back, way back, to 1966. Because you cannot understand the 917-30 without first understanding the world it was built to conquer. The Canadian-American Challenge Cup. Can-Am. Even the name sounds like freedom, doesn't it? Canadian, American, Challenge, Cup. It's expansive. It's continental. It's enormous in every sense. And the series lived up to that name in ways that are almost hard to believe today. Born in 1966, Can-Am was conceived as the anti-Formula One. While the FIA had Grand Prix racing locked down in a cage of regulations, displacement limits, aerodynamic restrictions, and political maneuvering, Can-Am threw open the doors and said something revolutionary. Build whatever you want. Seriously. That was essentially the rulebook. Minimum weight requirements existed, sure. Basic safety regulations were in place, because even in the Wild West, you don't want people dying unnecessarily. But beyond those thin guardrails, go absolutely wild. Any engine configuration, any displacement. Turbos, superchargers, exotic materials, bizarre aerodynamic devices. If your engineers could dream it up and your accountants could survive the bill, you could race it. And here's the thing people forget. That freedom attracted the absolute best minds in motorsport. Engineers who were suffocating under Formula One's restrictions suddenly had oxygen. Designers who wanted to experiment with radical concepts had a playground. The result was a series that moved faster technologically than anything else on four wheels. McLaren dominated the early years. Their iconic orange machines, powered by big block Chevrolet V8 engines, won the championship 5 consecutive times from 1967 to 1971. 5 in a row. In any other series, that level of dominance would have been controversial. In Can-Am, it was celebrated, because McLaren had simply out-engineered and out-driven everybody else. That was the deal. You earn your dominance. Nobody hands it to you. The crowds loved it. The prize money was serious. The racing was spectacular. International manufacturers were paying close attention. Now here's what most people don't realize about this period. The gap between McLaren and the field wasn't just about the car. It was about philosophy. McLaren approached Can-Am like a science experiment. Systematic testing, data collection, aerodynamic refinement. For the era, It was incredibly sophisticated. And when you combine that methodology with the freedom Can-Am offered, you get something formidable. The rest of the field was competitive, but always chasing, always slightly behind. The series had genuine racing, genuine drama, genuine uncertainty, just enough to keep everyone coming back. And then Porsche started watching. Really watching. Not casually glancing over from their endurance racing headquarters in Weissach, but genuinely studying, analyzing, planning. You have to understand where Porsche was in 1969, 1970, 1971. The 917 had already arrived, and it had arrived violently. The flat 12 engine, around 500 horsepower in original form, was propelling a car capable of over 200 miles per hour down the Mulsanne straight at Le Mans. Porsche won Le Mans in 1970 and 1971 with the 917. They were already operating at the bleeding edge of what was mechanically possible in endurance racing. But endurance racing had displacement limits. Can-Am didn't. And Porsche's engineers, brilliant, methodical, and perpetually hungry, started asking a question that would change motorsport history. What if we took everything we know about the 917 and removed the limits entirely? Look, the genius of what happened next isn't just engineering. It's strategic. Porsche identified Can-Am as a proving ground, a place where their technology could operate without the artificial ceiling of displacement restrictions. They saw an opportunity to advance their understanding of turbocharging, aerodynamics, and chassis dynamics in a real competition environment, with real stakes, against real competition. The knowledge gained would feed back into everything they built afterward. It was playing the long game while absolutely destroying the short game. Enter Mark Donohue. And I want to spend a moment here because Donohue is genuinely one of the most fascinating figures in American motorsport history, and he doesn't always get the recognition he deserves. Donohue wasn't just a driver, he was an engineer who happened to be extraordinarily gifted behind the wheel. He had a mechanical engineering degree from Brown University. He communicated with his crew about suspension behavior, aerodynamic balance, and power delivery with a precision that most drivers of his era simply couldn't match. Roger Penske, his team owner and one of the sharpest minds in American racing, described Donohue as indispensable not just because of his speed, but because of his feedback. Donohue had won the 1972 Indianapolis 500. He'd won Trans Am championships. He'd won at every level he'd competed. And when Penske formed a technical partnership with Porsche to campaign the 917-10 in the 1972 Can-Am season, Donohue became the bridge between the German engineers in Weissach and the American racing environment on track. The 917-10 that year used a turbocharged flat 12 producing somewhere around 900 horsepower. 900. In 1972. The McLarens were running naturally aspirated Chevrolet, making perhaps 550 horsepower. The writing wasn't just on the wall. It was painted in enormous letters that anyone paying attention could read clearly. Donohue won 2 races in 1972 with the 917-10, but more importantly, he and the Penske engineers learned. They understood the turbocharger's behavior. They identified the aerodynamic weaknesses. They found the chassis limits. They documented everything with the meticulous obsession that defined the Penske operation. And over the winter of 1972 to 1973, they took everything they'd learned and handed it back to Porsche's engineers with a simple message. Make it more of everything. What emerged from Weissach was the 917-30. And this is where it gets really interesting, because the numbers attached to this car don't just sound impressive, they sound fictional. The engine displaced 5.4 liters, twin-turbocharged flat 12. The official power figure Porsche quoted publicly was around 1,000 horsepower. But here's the thing, and this matters enormously, that was the conservative, track-ready, let's not frighten anyone number. In qualifying configuration, with boost pressure cranked up to levels that would make a modern engineer reach for a stiff drink, the 917-30's engine produced closer to 1,500 horsepower. 1,500. From an engine built in 1973. For context, because context is everything here, a modern Formula One car produces approximately 1,000 horsepower using 50 years of additional development, hybrid technology, sophisticated energy recovery systems, and materials that didn't exist in 1973. The 917-30 was making 50% more power than that using technology from half a century ago. If that doesn't make you stop and stare at the ceiling for a moment, I genuinely don't know what will. The chassis was purpose-built to manage this insanity. Extended wheelbase compared to the 917-10. Revised suspension geometry. A rear wing of truly enormous proportions generating downforce figures that made the car feel planted even at speeds that had no business being achievable on a road course. The dry weight sat around 1,800 pounds. The power-to-weight ratio existed in a category that had no name, because nothing had ever been there before. Donohue later described getting into the 917-30 as an experience that redefined his understanding of acceleration. And remember, this is a man who had driven an Indianapolis car at 200 miles per hour. He said the 917-30's acceleration was, and I'm paraphrasing his descriptions across multiple interviews, simply violent, not fast. Violent. Like physics was happening to you personally. The 1973 Can-Am season opened at Motorsport Park in Ontario, Canada, June. Early summer. The kind of day where racing feels alive, where the smell of fuel and rubber hangs in the air and you remember exactly why you fell in love with motorsport in the first place. Teams from across North America had gathered. McLaren was there, defending the legacy of 5 consecutive championships. Lola was present. Shadow had shown up with serious machinery. The competition wasn't weak. Let's be absolutely clear about that. These were professional racing operations with experienced engineers, substantial budgets, and genuine talent behind their wheels. They weren't pushovers. They weren't amateurs who wandered into the wrong parking lot. They were simply about to encounter something they had no answer for. Donohue put the 917-30 on pole position, not by a narrow margin. Not by the kind of slim advantage that makes the second-place team think they have a chance if they nail the perfect strategy or catch a lucky break. By seconds. Full seconds. In qualifying terms, where tenths of a second represent significant gaps between professional teams, being multiple seconds faster is the equivalent of showing up to a neighborhood basketball game as an NBA All-Star. The other teams could see the pole position time on the timing sheets. They could do the math. And the math was deeply, profoundly discouraging. Here's the thing about racing that casual fans sometimes miss. Qualifying speed doesn't always translate directly to race pace. Mechanical reliability, fuel consumption, tire degradation, traffic management, strategic decisions. All of these factors can level the playing field between a qualifying monster and a more conservative, consistent race setup. Plenty of cars throughout history have been blindingly fast over one lap and catastrophically unreliable over a race distance. So when Donohue led from the start at Motorsport, and then just kept pulling away, kept building the gap, kept extending his advantage lap after lap after lap, the reality of what had been built in Weissach started to sink in for everyone present. The 917-30 wasn't a qualifying special. It wasn't a one-lap wonder. It was a complete racing car that happened to operate in a performance dimension nobody else could access. Donohue won the Motorsport race by a margin that made the result feel less like a competition, and more like a time trial that happened to have other cars on track. The McLaren drivers crossed the finish line looking at a car that had essentially lapped them in spirit, if not literally. The engineers on the other teams walked back to their garages doing calculations, trying to figure out what adjustment, what development, what innovation could possibly close a gap that large. The answer, though none of them knew it yet, was nothing. There was nothing to be done. Road Atlanta was next. race 2 of 8. And if Motorsport had left any doubt, any lingering hope that the Motorsport result was a fluke, an anomaly, a perfect alignment of conditions that happened to favor the Porsche on that particular day, Road Atlanta ended it. Same story, different geography. Donohue qualified fastest. Donohue led from the start. Donohue won by a comfortable, embarrassing, completely demoralizing margin. The other teams weren't racing for victory anymore. They were racing for the minor places, for the points that kept their sponsors happy, for the dignity of finishing on the same lap. Now, you might be thinking, okay, 2 races. Maybe the other teams just haven't figured out how to respond yet. Racing teams adapt. They develop. They find answers. Give them time and the competition will tighten up. And that's a completely reasonable thought. It's the thought every optimistic competitor was having as the teams packed up and headed to Watkins Glen in New York for race 3. Surely by now McLaren had identified something. Surely Shadow had found an angle. Surely the accumulated data from 2 race weekends would reveal some weakness in the 917-30 that could be exploited. Watkins Glen pole position Donohue. Race winner, Donohue. Gap to second place, substantial. Mid-Ohio pole position Donohue. Race winner, Donohue. 4 races into an 8-race season, and the Porsche 917-30 had won every single one. The series that had been built on the promise of wide-open competition, of anything-goes engineering freedom, of genuine uncertainty about who would stand on the top step, had become a procession. A very expensive, very loud, very spectacular procession, but a procession nonetheless. And here's what most people don't realize about what was happening beneath the surface during this period. The damage wasn't just to the competitive balance on track. It was financial. It was institutional. It was existential. Think about the economics of racing for a moment. Teams need sponsors. Sponsors need exposure. Exposure comes from being visible, from being competitive, from having their logos associated with success. When one car wins every race by enormous margins, the cameras follow that car. The commentary focuses on that car. The post-race interviews happen with that car's driver. The sponsors on the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th place cars are essentially paying significant sums of money to be part of a supporting cast in someone else's movie. That's not a sustainable business model. Teams start making quiet phone calls, asking whether the investment makes sense, wondering if the resources might be better deployed elsewhere. And then there were the fans. Can-Am had built its audience on the promise of spectacle and competition. People paid for tickets because they wanted to see racing, genuine wheel-to-wheel, position-changing, strategically interesting racing. What they were getting in 1973 was a Porsche 917-30 disappearing into the distance, while everyone else competed furiously for second place. Now, the secondary battle was often genuinely exciting. Professional racing at any level produces drama when competitive machinery and skilled drivers are involved. But the headline act, the championship battle, the question of who wins, that was already answered before the race began. Race 5 took the series to Road America at Elkhart Lake, Wisconsin. If you've never seen Road America, picture 4 miles of flowing high-speed tarmac carved through the Wisconsin countryside. Long straights, fast sweeping corners, elevation changes, a track that rewards aerodynamic efficiency and raw power above almost everything else. In other words, a circuit that might as well have been designed specifically for the 917-30. Donohue's qualifying lap at Elkhart Lake became legendary within racing circles almost immediately. The time he set was so far removed from the rest of the field that engineers from competing teams reportedly walked away from the timing screens shaking their heads. Not in anger necessarily, but in the particular resigned bewilderment of professionals who understand exactly what they're looking at and know there's no rational engineering response available to them. The race itself followed the established pattern. Donohue led. Donohue won. The gap was enormous. The result was inevitable. By mid-season, a strange psychological phenomenon had taken hold throughout the paddock. The question being asked wasn't whether Donohue and the 917-30 would win. It was whether anything mechanical would stop them. Reliability had become the only realistic threat to Porsche's dominance. And even there, the Penske operation's legendary preparation minimized the risk. These were the people who famously cleaned their engines with toothbrushes before races, who documented every component's service history with a precision that would make aerospace engineers nod approvingly. Here's where the story takes a genuinely interesting turn, though. Because as I mentioned earlier, Donohue didn't win every race in 1973. And the two non-victories are actually more revealing about the 917-30's dominance than the 6 wins are. Laguna Seca, Race 6. The famous Californian circuit with its iconic corkscrew corner, a left-right combination taken partially blind over a hill that drops away beneath you. The 917-30 had qualified at the front as expected, and then, mid-race, a mechanical failure. The car retired. Not because anyone caught it, not because a rival found a strategic edge or exploited a weakness. The machine itself stopped, and even then, the reaction in the paddock wasn't celebration. It was relief. Uncomfortable, slightly guilty relief. The kind of relief you feel when you realize you've been let off a hook you had no business escaping from. The Riverside race later in the season produced a second-place finish after race day problems disrupted Donohue's rhythm. Again, not beaten by the competition. Compromised by circumstances. When the 917-30 finished races without significant problems, it won. Every single time. The other teams could have raced perfectly, executed flawless strategies, driven beyond their limits, and it wouldn't have mattered. The performance gap was simply too large for human ingenuity at the wheel to overcome. Mark Donohue won the 1973 Can-Am Championship with a dominance that statistics struggle to fully capture. 6 wins from 6 finishes. Championship secured with races remaining. The final points margin was enormous. By any objective measure, it was one of the most complete championship performances in the history of motorsport, in any category, at any level, anywhere in the world. And the response from the series organizers was telling. Because what they saw wasn't just one team winning a championship. What they saw was a problem. A fundamental, structural, potentially catastrophic problem. Can-Am had always operated on the implicit understanding that the freedom it offered would produce competitive diversity. Different solutions to the same challenge, different technical philosophies battling it out, creating genuine uncertainty and genuine racing. What the 917-30 had demonstrated was that if one team had enough resources, enough engineering talent, and enough creative freedom, they could build something so superior that the competition became meaningless. And look, I want to be precise about something here, because it matters for understanding what came next. The Can-Am organizers weren't stupid. They understood what they were dealing with. They understood that changing the rules to specifically target one team's car would be seen as exactly what it was, a political move designed to level a playing field that Porsche had legitimately, legally, brilliantly dominated. But they also understood that a racing series without genuine competition is a dying series. You cannot sell tickets to a foregone conclusion indefinitely. So they made their choice, and it would have consequences nobody fully anticipated. The fuel allocation rule that Can-Am introduced for the 1974 season was, on its surface, presented as something entirely reasonable. Progressive, even. The global oil crisis of 1973 had sent shockwaves through every industry on the planet. OPEC's embargo had created fuel shortages, skyrocketing prices, and a sudden, urgent cultural conversation about consumption and sustainability. Governments were implementing speed limits to reduce fuel usage. Manufacturers were scrambling to develop more efficient engines. The entire world was thinking about how much fuel things burned and whether that burning was justified. So when Can-Am announced that each car would be limited to a specific fuel allocation per race, calculated using a formula that accounted for engine displacement and configuration, The stated reasoning sounded perfectly sensible. We're being responsible. We're responding to the global energy situation. We're showing that motorsport is aware of its context. All very reasonable. All very defensible. All, and I want to be absolutely direct about this, completely and deliberately aimed at the Porsche 917-230 and its twin-turbocharged, fuel-devouring flat 12 engine. Here's the thing about the 917-30's relationship with fuel. The power it produced came from a very straightforward thermodynamic reality. More fuel burned equals more energy released, equals more power generated. The twin turbochargers forced additional air into the combustion chambers, allowing more fuel to be burned per cycle than a naturally aspirated engine could manage. It was fundamentally efficient in terms of power per unit of displacement. But in terms of power per unit of fuel, the equation looked very different. Running at full boost, extracting those 1,000 plus horsepower that made the car untouchable, the 917-30 consumed fuel at a rate that would make a modern engineer wince. The fuel allocation formula Can-Am developed was specifically calibrated to hurt turbocharged engines. The math wasn't neutral. It wasn't designed to affect all cars equally. It was engineered, and I use that word deliberately, to reduce the competitive advantage that forced induction gave Porsche. Under the new rules, running the 917-30 at full boost for an entire race distance was simply impossible. The fuel would run out long before the checkered flag. To finish a race, Porsche would need to reduce boost pressure, which meant reducing power, which meant reducing the performance advantage that made the car what it was. Porsche's engineers in Weissach ran the numbers carefully. They looked at the fuel allocation, calculated what boost levels would be sustainable over a race distance, worked out the resulting power output, and then compared that power output to what the naturally aspirated competition could produce. And what they found was deeply unflattering. The rule changes didn't just reduce the 917-30's advantage. They potentially eliminated it. A turbocharged engine running reduced boost and optimizing for fuel efficiency might not be significantly faster than a well-developed, naturally aspirated engine running freely. The entire performance philosophy of the car had been neutralized by a formula on a piece of paper. Roger Penske and Mark Donohue sat down with Porsche's management and had a frank conversation. Could they make the 917-30 work under the new regulations? Technically, yes. Would it be competitive? Possibly. Would it be the dominant, race-winning machine that had steamrolled the 1973 season? Almost certainly not. And Porsche made a decision that was entirely rational from a business perspective, but felt, to everyone who witnessed it, like watching something irreplaceable disappear. They withdrew. Porsche pulled out of Can-Am. Completely. No modified 917-30 adapted to the fuel rules. No scaled-back program. No customer cars entered as proxies. They left. Packed up the engineering resources, the technical knowledge, the institutional momentum of the most dominant campaign in Can-Am history, and redirected it elsewhere. To Group 4 racing, to Group 5, to endurance racing, to programs where the rules, however restrictive, were at least applied consistently and without what Porsche clearly viewed as specifically targeted hostility. Now, you might be thinking, well, that seems like an overreaction. Teams adapt to rule changes all the time. Formula One teams deal with new regulations every few years. NASCAR rewrites its rulebook constantly. Adaptation is part of racing. Why couldn't Porsche just adjust and compete under the new framework? And that's a completely fair question. Here's the answer. It's about philosophy. Can-Am had sold itself to Porsche, to Penske, to Donohue, and to everyone else involved in the program as something specific. A series where engineering freedom was the fundamental value proposition, where the implicit contract between the series organizers and the competitors was this: bring your best ideas, your best technology, your best execution, and compete on those merits. Porsche had honored that contract absolutely. They'd brought their best ideas. Their technology was extraordinary. Their execution was flawless. And when they won using those advantages, the series changed the contract retroactively. That's not adaptation to new rules. That's a betrayal of the founding principle. And Porsche, a company that took its engineering philosophy extremely seriously, wasn't interested in competing in a series that would simply rewrite the rules whenever one competitor became too successful. The precedent was clear and troubling. Win too convincingly, and we'll change the rules to stop you. What kind of incentive structure does that create for serious engineering investment? Look, I think about this dynamic a lot, because it appears throughout human competitive history in ways that extend far beyond motorsport. In technology, in business, in sports, there's a recurring pattern where genuine, legitimate excellence becomes so threatening to established order that the response isn't to match it but to regulate it away. To impose artificial limits on what excellence is allowed to achieve. And every time it happens, something is lost. Not just for the dominant competitor who gets constrained, but for the entire ecosystem that benefited from the innovation that dominance required. Can-Am, without the fuel restrictions, would have continued pushing the technological frontier. Other manufacturers, seeing what Porsche had achieved with turbocharging, would have developed their own forced induction programs. The competition would have escalated. The cars would have become faster. The engineering would have advanced. Fans would have witnessed machinery of truly extraordinary capability. Instead, the series chose to pull the frontier back to a place where the established order felt comfortable. The 1974 season went ahead, and it wasn't terrible racing. Honest competitors brought honest machinery and raced it honestly. Jackie Oliver won the championship for Shadow. There were genuinely close battles and legitimate competition. But the fields were smaller. The factory support that had made Can-Am's reputation was diminished. The sense that this was where the absolute cutting edge of sports car technology came to compete. That feeling was gone. Something ineffable had departed with the 917-30, and everyone in the paddock could feel its absence. The series staggered forward through the mid-70s, trying various rule changes and format adjustments to recapture its former vitality. None of it worked. The fundamental problem wasn't the rules. It was the perception. Can-Am had built its brand on unlimited innovation, and when it abandoned that brand, it lost the thing that made it unique. Other series had regulations. Other series had restrictions. Can-Am had freedom. Without freedom, Can-Am was just another racing series in a world that already had plenty of those. By 1974, the original Can-Am was effectively finished as a series championship. It limped along in various forms until 1987, when a revived version finally ended permanently. But the golden era, the period from 1966 through 1973 when the world's best engineers and drivers competed under essentially no rules, that ended with a fuel allocation formula targeted at a twin-turbocharged flat 12 engine from Stuttgart. Here's what most people don't realize about the aftermath. The 917-30 didn't disappear quietly. It went on to demonstrate its capabilities in ways that cemented its legendary status even outside of Can-Am competition. In 1975, Mark Donohue took a 917-30 to Talladega Superspeedway in Alabama. Not for a race. For a speed record attempt. Talladega is a banked oval, the kind of circuit where aerodynamic downforce works differently than on a road course, where the banking allows cars to carry speed through corners that would be impossible on flat tarmac. It was, in theory, a very different environment from the road courses where the 917-30 had earned its reputation. Donohue recorded an unofficial closed-course speed record of 221 miles per hour. 221. With a road racing car. On a track it was never designed for. The record stood for years. Think about what that number represents. In 1975, production cars were barely cracking 150 miles per hour at their absolute limits. The fastest road cars in the world, Ferrari Daytona, Lamborghini Countach, Porsche 911 Turbo, were operating in a completely different universe of speed. Donohue was going 70 miles per hour faster than the fastest road cars in a vehicle that also had to navigate chicanes, hairpins, and elevation changes on racing circuits. The technical legacy flowing from the 917 program, and specifically from the 917-30's development, spread through Porsche's racing history like water through rock. Slow, invisible, but ultimately shaping everything it touched. The lessons learned about managing turbocharger lag, about optimizing boost curves for different circuit characteristics, about building chassis rigid enough to handle enormous power while remaining sensitive enough to provide driver feedback, all of it went into the filing cabinets and engineering databases at WESAC. The 934 and 935, Porsche's dominant Group 4 and Group 5 competitors later in the 1970s, drew directly on 917 program knowledge. The 935 in particular, which became one of the most successful racing cars of its era, used turbocharging philosophy refined through the 917 experience. The 956 and 962, which between them won Le Mans 6 times during the 1980s, had aerodynamic and chassis DNA that traced back through the lineage to the 917 series. Even Porsche's modern 919 hybrid, the car that won Le Mans 3 consecutive times before Porsche withdrew it because, and this is almost darkly funny given our story, it was becoming too dominant. Even that car carried echoes of what Hans Mesger and his team had created in Weissach 50 years earlier. The engineering investment that Can-Am's freedom made possible paid dividends for Porsche across multiple decades and multiple racing categories. That's the thing about genuine innovation. It doesn't stay contained within the specific context where it was developed. It spreads. It feeds into subsequent work. It builds institutional knowledge that compounds over time. Porsche's willingness to develop the 917-30 without compromise, to pursue maximum performance without concern for whether competitors could match them, produced knowledge that made them better at everything they built afterward. Meanwhile, Can-Am's decision to restrict that innovation produced a series that nobody really remembers with the same reverence. Ask any serious motorsport historian about the great racing series of the 20th century, and they'll mention the golden Can-Am era in the same breath as early Formula One, the Le Mans golden years, the Group B rally era. Ask them about Can-Am after 1973, and you'll get a polite shrug. The contrast is instructive and uncomfortable, because it suggests something that competitive institutions generally don't want to acknowledge. Sometimes the presence of one dominant, exceptional competitor makes everything around them better. Their excellence raises the bar. Their innovation spread to the wider field. Their performance creates a target that motivates everyone else to push harder, think differently, invest more deeply. Removing that competitor in the name of competitive balance doesn't necessarily produce better competition. Sometimes it just produces more comfortable mediocrity. Mark Donohue deserves more than a footnote in this story. He deserves his own chapter. And I want to give it to him, because understanding the man behind the wheel of the 917-30 is essential to understanding why the car achieved what it did. Engineering creates potential, drivers realize it. And the relationship between Donohue and the 917-30 was something rarer and more complicated than a talented driver in a fast car. It was a genuine creative partnership between a human being and a machine, mediated by an engineering intelligence that belonged equally to both worlds. Born in Summit, New Jersey in 1937, Donohue came to racing through an unusual route for his era. Most drivers of his generation arrived via instinct and bravado, young men who discovered they had an extraordinary natural gift for going fast and pursued it with the single-minded intensity that defines athletic talent at its purest. Donohue had that gift. Nobody reaches the level he reached without genuine, innate speed. But he layered something on top of it that most drivers of his era simply didn't possess. A systematic, analytical, almost academic approach to understanding why a car behaves the way it does and how to make it behave better. His mechanical engineering degree from Brown University wasn't decorative. It wasn't the kind of qualification that gets mentioned in a biography and then forgotten because the real story is all about the racing. Donohue actually used it. He thought about cars the way engineers think about systems, as collections of interacting components, each with measurable characteristics, each capable of being optimized, each contributing to an overall performance outcome that could be understood, predicted, and improved through careful analysis. When something felt wrong with a car's handling, Donohue didn't just say it feels loose at the rear. He described the specific conditions under which the behavior occurred: the speed range, the corner radius, the surface characteristics, the throttle position, the steering input. He gave his engineers information they could actually use. Roger Penske understood this quality immediately. Penske himself was an extraordinarily intelligent racing mind, a former driver who had transitioned into team ownership with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized his driving career. The Penske operation was already known for its preparation standards when Donohue joined. Engines cleaned with toothbrushes. Components inspected to tolerances that seemed excessive until you understood that excessive preparation was exactly the point. In Donohue, Penske found a driver who matched his own standards and extended them further. Together, they created something that functioned less like a conventional racing team, and more like a mobile engineering laboratory with a competition department attached. Here's the thing about the 917-30 development that often gets lost in the retelling of the car's dominance. The machine that showed up at Motorsport in June 1973 wasn't the machine that left Weissach several months earlier. It had been through an exhaustive development process during which Donohue's feedback was central to every significant decision. The boost curve, the way turbo pressure built through the rev range, was shaped partly by Donohue's descriptions of how the power delivery felt on corner exits. The aerodynamic balance, the relationship between front and rear downforce, was refined through Donohue's detailed accounts of how the car responded to different wing configurations at different speeds. The suspension geometry that allowed the 917-30 to be both devastatingly fast and remarkably consistent over a race distance reflected dozens of incremental adjustments made in response to Donohue's feedback sessions. The Porsche engineers at Weissach were brilliant. Hans Mezger, who had designed the engine, was one of the great powertrain engineers of the 20th century. The chassis engineers understood aerodynamics and structural dynamics at a level that few contemporaries could match. But they were building a car that needed to perform on North American road courses, in conditions they couldn't fully replicate in Germany, against competition they couldn't perfectly simulate in testing. Donohue was their real-world instrument, the interface between theoretical engineering excellence and practical racing reality. Without him, the 917-30 might still have been extraordinary. With him, it became something that transcended the category of merely extraordinary and entered a different realm entirely. There's a story, recounted by several people who were present, about a testing session during the 917-30's development where Donohue came in after a run and told the engineers that the car felt as though it was trying to kill him in a specific, identifiable way, but that he thought he understood what the car wanted and could work with it. That phrase, what the car wanted, captures something important about the relationship between great drivers and great machines. The best drivers don't just tolerate a car's characteristics. They develop an intuitive model of the machine's behavior and find a way to operate within it, to exploit its strengths and manage its weaknesses, to become the missing piece that completes the engineering puzzle. With 1,100, 1,200, potentially 1,500 horsepower available, the 917-30 demanded a very specific kind of trust from its driver. Turbochargers create power in a way that's fundamentally different from naturally aspirated engines. Rather than a smooth, predictable power curve that rises steadily with revs, a turbocharged engine of this era delivered its power in a surge. Boost pressure builds, and then suddenly the power arrives, all of it. Urgently, insistently, with limited tolerance for imprecision in throttle management. Getting on the power too early in a corner before the car's attitude is properly settled means asking the rear tires to handle both the lateral load of cornering and the longitudinal load of acceleration simultaneously. That's a negotiation that the tires sometimes lose dramatically. Donohue managed this negotiation with a consistency and precision that astonished his contemporaries. His throttle inputs were described by engineers monitoring telemetry as almost impossibly smooth. Not slow, not hesitant, but progressive in a way that kept the power delivery within the tire's ability to translate it into forward motion rather than spectacular, expensive sideways motion. This smoothness wasn't natural talent operating on instinct. It was disciplined technique, developed through systematic understanding of what the turbocharger was doing and when, and deliberately applied on every corner of every lap of every race. It was engineering, expressed through a human body rather than through metal and carbon fiber. Now, I want to address something directly, because it comes up whenever people discuss Donohue's legacy. There are those who argue that the 917-30 was so superior that any reasonably competent professional driver could have won with it, that Donohue's contribution was less about exceptional skill and more about being the available driver when Penske and Porsche assembled the best car in the field. This argument misunderstands both Donohue and the 917-30. The car was not easy to drive. It was not forgiving of mistakes. It did not allow average drivers to look exceptional. Several other professional drivers had exposure to Porsche's 917 series machinery during this period, and none of them produced results that approached what Donohue achieved. The car needed him as much as he needed the car. And look, this matters beyond the specific context of Can-Am 1973. Because one of the recurring debates in motorsport is about the relative contribution of driver and machine to championship success. When one team dominates, the inevitable question is whether the driver is genuinely exceptional or merely well-resourced. The 917-30's dominance was so complete that it would be easy to dismiss Donohue's role. That would be a mistake. The car set the performance ceiling. Donohue operated at it consistently, across multiple circuits, multiple weather conditions, multiple competitive situations. That consistency is the fingerprint of genuine excellence. His death in August 1975 remains one of motorsport's most painful losses, not least because of its circumstances. Donohue had briefly retired from racing after the Can-Am program ended, stepping back from competition and focusing on his role within the Penske organization. But retirement didn't hold. The competitive drive that had defined his entire adult life reasserted itself, and when Penske entered Formula One with a customer March chassis for the 1975 season, Donohue came back to drive it. Formula One in 1975 was a different environment from anything Donohue had experienced. The politics were different. The technical culture was different. The circuits were different. Many of them permanent facilities with characteristics very unlike the North American road courses where he'd built his reputation. He was learning, adapting, applying the same systematic approach to a new context. At the Austrian Grand Prix at the Österreichring, during a practice session on August 17th, a tire failed on his march at high speed. The car struck the barriers with enormous force. Donohue sustained severe head injuries. He was conscious initially, and those present reported that he seemed to be recovering. 2 days later, on August 19, 1975, he died from the injuries. He was 38 years old. The racing world's response was one of genuine grief, not the performative mourning that sometimes accompanies the loss of a famous name, but real sadness at the departure of someone who had made the activity better simply by participating in it. Drivers who had raced against him spoke about what it meant to share a track with someone who combined his level of skill with his level of intelligence. Engineers who had worked with him described the experience as professionally transformative. Roger Penske, not a man given to public displays of emotion, was visibly devastated. What Donohue left behind was a body of work that racing historians return to repeatedly because it demonstrates something that gets lost in the noise of contemporary motorsport. That the pursuit of genuine excellence, of finding the absolute limit of what is possible within a given set of constraints and then operating at that limit with consistency and discipline, is its own form of art. The 6 victories in the 1973 Can-Am season weren't just results in a record book. They were performances. expressions of a philosophy about how racing should be approached and what it can achieve when approached that way. This is where it gets really interesting, because Donohue's story and the 91730 story intersect with a broader question about how we relate to exceptional performance. Human beings have a complicated relationship with dominance. We're drawn to it. We celebrate it when it belongs to our team, our driver, our manufacturer. We resent it when it belongs to someone else. And we have a persistent, culturally embedded instinct to level playing fields, to ensure that competition remains accessible, that no single competitor can accumulate an advantage so large that the outcome becomes predetermined. This instinct comes from a good place. Competition derives its meaning from uncertainty. If we know who will win before the contest begins, we're not watching competition. We're watching theater. The desire to preserve genuine uncertainty is legitimate and important. But here's the tension that the 91730 story exposes so vividly. When the playing field is leveled by imposing artificial restrictions on what excellence is allowed to achieve, rather than by other competitors rising to meet it, something essential is lost. The message sent to everyone considering making the kind of investment Porsche made. The years of engineering work, the financial commitment, the intellectual energy devoted to pushing the absolute frontier of what's possible. That message is troubling. Push too far and we'll change the rules. Be too good and we'll penalize you for it. Excel beyond a certain threshold and the institution you're excelling within will find a way to constrain you. That's not an incentive structure that produces innovation. It's an incentive structure that produces comfortable mediocrity dressed up as competitive balance. And Can-Am's trajectory after 1973 makes the argument empirically. The series that chose balance over excellence slowly became irrelevant. The technological frontier it had once represented moved elsewhere, to Group 5, to endurance racing, to Formula 1, to any competitive arena that still rewarded genuine, unrestricted ambition. The 917-30 cars that survive today, a handful of them in museums and private collections, carry that history with them. When one runs at a historic event, as occasionally happens, the sound is genuinely shocking even to people who've heard recordings and think they're prepared. The flat 12 at speed produces a note that exists at the intersection of mechanical violence and musical perfection. A shrieking, howling, deeply physical assault on the senses that makes everything else on track sound polite by comparison. People who experience it firsthand describe it as the closest thing to understanding what 1973 actually felt like that's currently available. There's a question I keep coming back to every time I think about the Porsche 917-30 and the 1973 Can-Am season. Not the technical questions, not the historical questions, but something more fundamental. Something that sits underneath all the horsepower numbers and lap times and championship points and reaches into territory that feels uncomfortably relevant to the world we're living in right now. The question is this: what do we actually want from competition? What are we asking for when we build a racing series or a business environment or any arena where human beings and their ideas go head-to-head and we declare a winner? Because Can-Am thought it knew the answer. The answer was freedom. Unlimited, unrestricted, unapologetic freedom to innovate, to invest, to build the best possible version of whatever you could imagine. That freedom was the product. That freedom was the promise. And for 7 years, from 1966 through 1972, it delivered something genuinely extraordinary. Racing that pushed technology forward. Competition that attracted the best minds and the biggest ambitions. A championship that meant something precisely because winning it required genuine, comprehensive excellence across engineering, driving, preparation, and strategy. And then one team honored that promise too completely, took the freedom too seriously, built something so excellent that excellence itself became the problem. Here's what I find most fascinating about the institutional response to the 917-30. The people who changed the rules weren't villains. They weren't acting in bad faith or from corrupt motives. They were genuinely trying to preserve something they cared about. A racing series with history, with fans, with competitive drama. They saw dominance destroying that drama, and they intervened. The intervention was logical. The intervention was understandable. The intervention killed the patient. Because here's the thing about institutions built on a founding philosophy. You cannot violate the founding philosophy in defense of the institution without destroying what made the institution worth defending. Can-Am was worth caring about because of its freedom. Restricting that freedom to preserve Can-Am meant preserving the name while eliminating the substance. What survived after 1973 was a racing series called Can-Am that had abandoned the thing that made Can-Am matter. It was a body without a soul, technically alive, functionally irrelevant. Now, you might be thinking this is a lesson specifically about motorsport, about the particular challenges of managing a racing series when technology gaps become too large. And yes, it's absolutely that. But I'd argue it's also something larger. Look at the history of innovation in any field, and you'll find this pattern recurring with uncomfortable regularity. A system designed to encourage ambitious thinking produces someone who thinks too ambitiously. The system's response is to constrain ambition rather than encourage others to match it. And the system slowly loses its ability to produce the kind of thinking that made it valuable in the first place. The Porsche 917-30 was a monument to a specific kind of courage. Not the courage of driving, though that was certainly present. The courage of commitment, of deciding to pursue an idea to its absolute limit without hedging, without holding back, without leaving performance on the table out of concern for how competitors might respond or how the series might react. Porsche committed. Penske committed. Donohue committed. They built the best thing they could build, raced it as hard as it could be raced, and let the results speak. The results said 1,500 horsepower. The results said 6 wins from 6 finishes. The results said 221 miles per hour on a banked oval in a road racing car. The results were so loud and so clear and so completely unambiguous that the only available response was silence, or rule changes. The series chose rule changes, Porsche chose silence, and departure, and the quiet, productive work of applying everything they'd learned to the next challenge, and the one after that, and the one after that. This is where it gets really interesting, because that choice, to take the knowledge and move on rather than fight to preserve a position in a series that had changed its rules to eliminate them, turned out to be exactly right. Not just strategically, but philosophically. Porsche didn't need Can-Am. Can-Am needed Porsche. The series that tried to stop them ended. Porsche kept winning Le Mans for another 50 years. Here's what most people don't realize when they look back at this story from the comfortable distance of half a century. The 917-30 didn't lose. It was never defeated on track. It was legislated, fuel-restricted, and politically maneuvered out of a series that couldn't handle what it had created. There's a profound difference between being beaten and being removed. Between a competitor finding a faster answer and an institution changing the question. The 917-30 answered every question Can-Am actually asked. The series just decided it didn't like the answer. Mark Donohue understood this. In his memoir, The Unfair Advantage, he wrote about the pursuit of the unfair advantage as the legitimate goal of serious racing preparation, finding the legal, creative, engineering edge that others haven't found yet. That's not cheating. That's excellence. The title acknowledged something important. Genuine competitive advantage always feels unfair to the people on the wrong side of it. The 917-30 was the ultimate expression of that philosophy. Legal, brilliant, overwhelming, and ultimately removed not by competition, but by regulation. So here we are, more than 50 years later, and the Porsche 917-30 still matters. Not as a historical curiosity. Not as a footnote in a championship record book, but as a permanent, unanswerable argument for what happens when you let engineers dream without limits and give them the resources to make those dreams real. The car was too fast, too powerful, too dominant for its era. It killed Can-Am by being exactly what Can-Am asked for. And in doing so, it became something that no rule change could touch. A legend. Complete, permanent, and entirely unfair. That's the Porsche 917-30. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, and drop a comment telling me whether you think Can-Am made the right call changing those rules. I genuinely want to know where you land on that one.